Welcome. This is a special live podcast recording for a podcast I host called Spotlight On, where we focus on music and arts and culture. It's typically an interview format for the show. Today is a little bit different, a little bit special. We're going to be in conversation with an entire ensemble. So I'm Lawrence Purrier, your host, and this is James Falzone's Division Ensemble.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this warm Saturday afternoon, a strange time to be, in a club. But we're so glad you're here. I'm James, as Lawrence just said. This is Wayne Horvitz on piano, Abbey Blackwell on the bass, Ray Larsen on trumpet, Rocky Martin on the drums. The idea of this podcast is to be talking about improvisation, kind of writ large, and we'll have a rich conversation about the art of improvisation. And we're going to do a lot of playing. We're going to start off with a composition of mine, which is called G.F.O.P. And if you know what that means, I was going to say I'd buy you a drink, but the bar's not open. So the next time you're here, I'll buy you a drink. One, two,
that's a great place to start. So before I jump in directly with James and the band, as I was getting to know James throughout this process and we were preparing and spending some time together, there was a phrase he used multiple times, which was, this music can be magical, but it's not magic. And as a layperson, as somebody who loves the music, who consumes the music, who studies and follows it, I'm not sure I agree, because it seems like magic when I see it done. And to be this close to it, I am understanding more about the magical nature. But I wonder, my first question for you, James, is I need you to level set for me in the audience a little bit about what are we talking about when we say improvised music, and how is that different, or how does that contrast with the fact that we're sitting here with music stands and sheet music, and sort of what's improvised and what's not here? What's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were talking about how there's a lot of great questions these days, and that's a great question about this music. The music that we just played fits on, it was on 3 pieces of sheet music, but it could easily have just fit on 1 or 2. And typically when you play a piece of music that fits on 2 pieces of sheet music, you're talking about a piece that might just last a minute or 2. And so that piece, we could have extended that for 15 more minutes if we wanted to, which gives you an idea that what's on the page is not much of what we're actually creating. In that particular tune, as you heard, there was a set of composed elements, some areas of counterpoint, that's a melody that I wrote, bass line that goes along with it, some different back and forth and so forth. But then we venture off into an improvisation, and that improvisation could have gone in many, many different directions, right? We decided to do a kind of interesting juxtaposition of a duo between Ray and I, and then going to a trio that was cued back and forth between myself and Wayne, and that had a kind of like trying to throw off the kilter about when we were going to be able to indulge the improvisation. So every time we got into something, we'd get interrupted by the trio. Every time they got into something, they'd get interrupted by the duo, until eventually it just lapsed into a full quintet. So that whole section there was improvised until I cued us back through some material back into the melodic material. And this is a tried and tested way of making music in a jazz context, right? If you've listened to a lot of historic traditional jazz, this is the way that most of that music is made. There's some kind of a melodic shape, what we tend to call a head, and then there's an improvisation on that melodic material, chord changes and so forth. Then you go back to the original material. This is the way the greats of Charlie Parker and Louis Armstrong and John Coltrane and so forth have made music for many, many decades. The music that we're creating in this ensemble, and much of what I do in my work, has elements of that, and yet much of the improvisation is not based on chord changes or based on the melodic material. We are going to play a composition of mine later on that does have form and melody and harmonies, so we could show a little bit of different ways in which we're improvising. But in this case, kind of getting to your question, we're essentially using the melodic material that I created as a springboard for our improvising. So I think when I say often that it's magical, but it's not magic, part of the interest of this discussion is to try to pull the hood up a little bit and look under the hood of what it means to do this music. And there's a lot that goes into the creation of a piece like you just heard that is based on a lot of pre-knowledge, thought, rehearsal, although this ensemble didn't rehearse that much, but the kind of collective rehearsal that we've all done and individual practice and so forth. All that comes together to make that possible. And therefore, it's magical and wonderful, and music is magical and wonderful, but there's no smoke and mirrors going on here. It's a lot of hard work, practice, knowledge about what's happening with the music, knowledge about what's possible, and then the interaction of some really fine musicians up on the stage in the moment.
How does an improvised or an improvisatory ensemble, how do they rehearse? What are you rehearsing?
Yeah, so we rehearsed only essentially that written material. So this band, as far as I know, this collection of musicians had never played together until Thursday. So this past Thursday, we had a rehearsal, brief 1.5-hour rehearsal. I've played with each of these musicians in different contexts. I have an ensemble called the Division Ensemble, which has Ray and Rocky in it. The pianist and bass player were not available to be here today, and so I called two of my favorite musicians with Wayne and Abbey. But our rehearsal was just to go over the written material. And even in the midst of rehearsing, we spent a little time improvising and kind of creating the concepts of how we wanted to use the improvisation. But it really was to go over the written material that's on the page. And we will give an example in a bit here, too, of an improvisation that has nothing written. We will just create something from nothing.
Mm-hmm. So that point reminds me of something else I learned in preparing for today and some other lessons that James gave me through some reading material, which is essentially that there's no wall between the audience and the performer in terms of the ability to be improvisers. In fact, something that's stood out very strongly for me is that we all improvise constantly, whether it's conversation. I was thinking about it the other day when I was driving, especially here in Seattle. I have the Maps application open. I have my destination where I want to go, but I'm constantly forced to react and take in my surroundings. Some people do it when they're cooking. They may follow a recipe, but they may deviate. They may like something a little bit more. They may encounter something that's in their refrigerator. There's all these ways in which we improvise constantly, and we never think about those as being magic. There's no, but the results often are magical. We get there early. We get there at all. We get there in one piece. We have a wonderful meal. We have a stimulating conversation. And so I think it's really important for listeners of this music to realize that they have all of the same capabilities, maybe not the technical tools in the toolbox, but the human capabilities to be improvisers.
Yeah, I really appreciate this comment. The great George Lewis, who is not only a wonderful composer and trombone player, but also a scholar about improvisation, he has said beautifully that improvisation is a way of being. Right? It's not just a technique. It's not just a thing that musicians do or dancers do or that comics do. We are all improvisers. It's a way of being. It's the way that human beings navigate life. Right? And so part of why I think that improvised music is so fascinating to experience as a listener, as a participant, is because it's mimicking, it's mirroring a bit as a metaphor of what it's like to go through life. Right? And so, and as you, again, pull the hood up a little bit and look under and say, how is this working? You realize, oh, I understand how they're improvising. I have a little experience of that, too, in my own work. I've talked with many people about improvisation. Surgeons, you might think, that's not a place you want to see improvisation, is in surgery, and yet a surgeon will talk about what it's like to actually be improvising. You have no idea what you're really going to experience. Right? I've talked with martial arts experts who talk about fighting as an improvisation. I've talked with farmers about improvisation. It's a fascinating way to think about what it means to experience life. Cooking, I think, is also a really good metaphor and one that I indulge in quite a bit myself.
Yeah. Well, before we get to some more music, can you just tell me a little bit, or tell the audience a little bit about the role of time in improvisation?
Yes. So music is an art form that exists in time. That may seem obvious or not to you, but what musicians do is we're carving up time. Composers do that when they're creating music and writing it down. You're thinking about how you want the audience to experience time. I had a composition teacher one time who Bob Brookmeyer, some of you may know that name, is a really well-known jazz composer who's passed on now. And I brought a piece to him, and he said, this isn't very good. He's kind of a craggly, curmudgeonly guy. He said, this is not very good composition. He said, just remember, every time you compose something, you're taking the audience closer to their death. And I just thought, oh my God, that sounds awful. I did not want to do that. But what he meant is that I'm taking up your time. If I'm composing a piece of music and you're experiencing that and spending time listening to it, you are now, you've just spent 10 minutes with me in my composition, so I better make that time good for you, right? So musicians are constantly carving up time. There's a great writer whose name is Stephen Nachmanovitch, and he wrote a book called Free Play, which I like to talk about as the gateway to improvisation studies. It's a wonderful, very readable book, been translated into many, many languages. And Nachmanovitch says that in music there are three kinds of time. There's the inspiration, the time of inspiration, the time of realization, and the time of communication. The inspiration is when somebody's conceiving of the music. They haven't written anything down yet, but they're being inspired to create something. That could be a commission, or it could be an influence they have to say, I want to express myself in this way. There's that time. Then there's the realization of the time of realization, in which you might be writing it down or recording it. There's that time in which it gets kind of imprinted in some way. And then there's the communication, usually in which transpires through performance. In improvised music, all three of those are happening in the now. Right? So if we look at a piece by Bach, Bach wrote the cello suites in the 18th century, and he was inspired to create that piece. He realized them, wrote them down, and they are communicated, performed ever since. Very, very famous pieces of music that get played all the time, right? So that whole process has taken centuries, and it will continue for centuries. In this music, all of those three things, inspiration, realization, communication, have been condensed into the moment of the now, the present moment, right? And I think musicians all over the world are very, very thoughtful about what it means to be in the moment, to be thinking about the now, and letting all that inspiration, all that realization, all that communication happen within the context of a performance. And before we play the next piece, which I'll introduce here, you might think about a definition of improvisation, right? Which has traditionally been thought of is creation through performance, right? So it is the creation of something by performing it, as opposed to creating it and then allowing it to be performed, right? So there's that conflation of these three kinds of time. We're going to play another piece of mine. All the music today are my compositions, and this is called There Is Often Another Way. And what I want you to listen for here is that there's going to be some simultaneity. That means that there's going to be improvisation happening from one person in the ensemble while the rest of us are playing a melodic shape. Then that's going to switch, and there'll be somebody else improvising while the others are playing that same melodic shape. And there'll be some kind of improvising in the midst of that. And you might also listen a bit to Rocky back there on drums and percussion, and how he colors the whole thing, right? There'll be melodic shapes and improvisation, and then there's all this sort of wash of color coming from the drums. And so maybe we'll even get Rocky to talk a little bit about how he's conceiving about what he's doing as he colors this piece. So here is There Is Often Another Way.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So tell me a little bit about the choices everyone has before them in a piece like that. Specifically for what I would call the sort of supporting cast, when the front line is soloing, what's going on and what are the other players experiencing and choosing between?
Yeah, well, I'd like to turn it over to some of these folks to answer that great question. But certainly in this music, it's less about foreground, background, or frontline, backline. It really is a communal experience. That piece in particular was very communal. But I'd love to hear, maybe, Rocky, if you're up for it, grabbing the mic back there, to hear how Rocky is thinking about, he probably has the least amount of material there in terms of what it is to play on. And so he's listening and experiencing and responding to what we're doing. So, Rocky, thoughts about your choices back there on the drums?
It's very inspiring to play with all of you and the way the music breathes. It's always the now and the listening of it all. So my role is to color but change each time the melody presents itself. And this time around, it kind of felt like an ocean to me, or we're on the bank of an ocean, and it's kind of rising with the waves each time, and I am changing depths and changing colors, and the way the band responded, I'm responding back with some sort of a crashing third time through. It feels like we are moving forward with more of a momentum, with more of a it's a pulse, but there's a pulse the whole time. Words are so interesting. That's what I'll say for now.
Actually, I'd love to. You just said there wasn't any traditional pulse happening in that piece, and yet you just described it as having pulse, which I love, and I agree with you 100%. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you think of pulse when there isn't actually a pulse. That sounds very mystical, but yeah.
Like one of my heroes, his name is Milford Graves, and so Milford talks about our biorhythms, and so we all have heart rates and heart rate variability, and that's always in cycles. And he says if you have the same exact heart rate every single time, that's dangerous. You want to have, a flow and a pulse and a kind of a shift. But all that being said, while we were playing on the second time around especially, it felt like more of I'm trying to create a more consistent enough pulse. And the third time I kind of gave that more clearly. But we're not quite in time in that second time around, but I'm feeling the band as having this consistent cyclic kind of wave feeling.
Mm.
Yeah, it's that sense of feeling time in the moment, inspiration, realization, communication, kind of contracted all into one that's going on. Yeah.
A lot of what you've talked about so far has to do with almost like best case scenario. Everybody's feeling it and hearing it and responding to it. What happens when there is not consensus, or there's a dispute about the direction the music should take? Is that playing out?
I don't hire those people.
That's one way to
I don't want them on the bandstand. It's fascinating. I don't think it happens as often as people might think. Right. So, but when it happens, it's really just a negotiation between great musicians who are hearing things and responding to them, and trying to edge somebody into what you would like them to do, perhaps. So, for instance, in that particular piece, there's a melodic shape that Ray and I are able to play exactly as written or not. And that time, I kind of really love playing in unison with Ray. We both have similar approaches, and we both can play in tune with each other. So I was kind of edging him along to play more of the melody. And after a couple cycles through, you may have heard he started to do that, right? So in my mind, I was thinking, I'd love to hear a little bit more melody out of Ray. So all I did was play a little bit more melody. And at some point, Ray just started to play more melody with me. So was that a mistake or something that wasn't realized in perfection? Not at all. It was just, I'd like to see this shift in the moment, shift a different way. And so by having really sensitive musicians up here who are listening to each other and feeling each other in terms of the music and that pulse that Rocky's talking about, anything is possible. And if we extend that idea of the metaphor of improvisation as being akin to life, a way of being, to quote George Lewis again, you may experience that in communication with people in your lives and work, in your relationships with your families and so forth. That's very much how it's like to just interact with human beings on a regular basis. Is not really about mistakes or imperfections, but about how do we make this be more in tune with one another, more in tune with what is equitable and sensible for those around us. Yeah.
Take us a little closer to death.
Oh, that's a great phrase. Yeah, easy to do. A great cue to play some more music, and then we'll make sure we hear from everybody in the group at different points. We're going to play a tune of mine, another composition of mine called Brooklyn Lines. I wrote it in a quick residency I had in Brooklyn several years ago. And it's kind of a spiky melody that has a lot of counterpoint, so you can listen for that. And then it really gets into what I call a kind of free jazz aesthetic, which is just a really high energy, fast-paced jazz pulse in which Ray and I are going to be improvising. Then it will switch gears and go into something completely different. And so you might listen to the different approaches to improvisation. And you might listen to the counterpoint between the different lines and how they interact with one another, and then how they influence our improvisation. So here's Brooklyn Lines.
I'd be curious to hear from James and some of the other band members about the role of sort of focus and attention, and how you maintain that during a piece. Like I guess the better way to ask would be about situational awareness. I think about it in the context of maybe a basketball team moving up and down the court, and who's where, and when they're in position and out of position. What's that experience like amongst the players on the stage?
Yeah, I'm gonna turn this over to Wayne, if you don't mind, here in just a second. But because I'd love to hear the way Wayne was thinking about what he was thinking about on that piece. But one of the things that's so special about, I think, about experiencing improvised music is that what we are doing is both creating and reacting in the same moment, right? You're making something happen, and you're anticipating what's going to happen. And if you follow me, you're also making sense of what just happened. So you're making in the moment, you're moving into the future, and you're also responding to what has just happened. And I refer to this often, people who know me and spend time with me, I'm always talking about the already and the not yet. The already is that which has just happened or is happening, and yet we're also dealing with the not yet. And you're just in that middle space between those two things. And to your point, that takes a tremendous amount of concentration. You cannot lose yourself in the music. You do lose yourself in the music, but part of your brain is constantly thinking about what's happening, what's going to happen, what happened. Wayne, curious, you had a lot of notes to play on that piece, but you also had to improvise. And so tell us a little bit about what's going through your mind and the role of the piano in a tune like that.
Well, I'm not sure I had to improvise, is the way to put it. But
I told you to improvise.
I was looking forward to improvising. No, I just think your original question, Lawrence, was essentially about, say it one more time, the very first thing you said.
I'm curious about the sort of role or the balance between attention and focus and sort of situational awareness.
That was the phrase I was looking for, yeah. Well, I think one thing that's really important for me is that I don't think the line between improvised music and written music is all that great. I think it's all just one essential arc. And for me, for someone who started really late and didn't have really kind of typical classical training or a strong jazz training, it's when I'm reading the music that I have to worry about my awareness like the most. Once I was with a friend of mine in the Sales Symphony, and we played this long piece for 2 pianos, 2 clarinets and violin, and I didn't finish the score. It was to a silent film, so there was about 10 minutes that I just never got around to finishing. So I improvised with the saxophone player the whole time, and my friend Misha turned to me and said, "Wayne, that was the only time you looked relaxed during the entire hour and a half." And so I also think that if you kind of come up the way I did, which was listening to rock and roll and blues bands and stuff, I mean, improvising is almost like the comfort zone, you know. But the awareness is, I don't know, I don't think about it that much, but it's, I mean, it's in your body. You have to be there all the time. And I feel like that's a lifelong struggle of not always being there, you know, and all sorts of things. I mean, it brings you back to when you were talking about when everybody isn't in the same zone. One of the classic things, like we're going to play a piece, if I'm not mistaken, that's going to be completely improvised. One of the classic things about that is that in everything you've heard so far, James in this case, because he's the leader and wrote the music, has kind of control about when we move on. Yeah. And in an improvised music piece, one of the classic things you find is like, the people that you love to play with, because you almost always come to an agreement about when the piece ends, and the people you never want to play with again because you've ended the piece 7 times and they keep playing. And that is really a thing about, you know, I think it's really overstated. Again, I really think it's overstated about improvised versus structured music versus written music. I mean, I think classical players are improvising to some extent all the time, and the way that they experience time is the same thing. I mean, what just happened and what's going to happen is absolutely as important if you're playing Bach as it is. And also think it's really important to mention that, you know, 90% of the world music traditions are based in improvisation, and that it's just, I'm always amazed when people make a big deal out of improvisation because you said it. Every time you get on the freeway, you're improvising. I mean, it is actually the default way we manage things. And so anyway.
No,
That's great.
That's really important points, and it's important to remember that if we think about the juxtaposition between classical music and non-classical music, in Western classical music, improvisation was a part of training and a part of the experience and a part of making that music for centuries, right? It was a way in which musicians were always trained. And it wasn't until really 19th century that musicians began to go through training and not have improvisation as being part of their lives.
Yeah, and even that is cultural. I mean, my friends who learned, who went to conservatory in Moscow, for example, they all learned to play cadenzas as part of their training, which is an improvisatory thing at the end of a piece. If you're the flute player or the first violinist in a piece, there might be a cadenza. So I think that's just, we're all dealing with the same materials. I mean, the real major distinctions between types of music are like, is the octave divided into 12 equal parts as it is in the music that we accept that in jazz and in classical music, but we don't accept that in Korea or in India and those things. And those things are kind of radical differences in a way, Anyway, that's what I think.
Let's do an open improvisation in which we are not looking at any composed or pre-thought material at all. And let's see how that changes the way we interact and the way that it's experienced. And as Wayne rightfully said, a lot of the pieces that we're playing, I'm the one who kind of brings us out of the improvisation. You may have heard that in a couple of these tunes. I'm playing some kind of line which indicates to all of them, okay, let's move on, right? And I'm the one who's sort of cueing those things. In this case, everything is now equalized. There is nobody leading what we'll create now.
So something that I'm curious about after witnessing that is sort of preparedness. And I don't necessarily mean years of education or technical capability, but how do you get into a place to be able to do that? And are there adjacent practices that support that in your life? Physical fitness, spiritual practice, math games, it seems like you're entering a very specific place to be able to do that.
Yeah, I'd love to turn part of this over to Ray here to answer that question. I'll just say that there's a misnomer somehow that musicians who are improvising are just winging it, right? You're just up here making it all up, and you don't have to practice anything, and it's it's so laid back, and yet musicians who are involved in improvisation in any way, shape, or form, and also for that matter, dancers and theater artists and so forth, anybody improvising, there is so much going into being prepared to be spontaneous. Musicians in particular that I work with who are improvisers spend so much time on their craft because you have to be able to be ready for anything in the moment. And that means a knowledge of theory and a great amount of execution on your instrument and ability to play in an ensemble and so forth. So Ray, if I turn this over to you, maybe you could talk a little bit about the ways in which you prepare to be a great improviser. I don't just mean in this particular context this afternoon, but just to be able to be prepared to be an improviser.
I want to start by saying how fun and rare this conversation is. When we rehearse, we as a group or we as individuals with any other musicians, we oftentimes prepare the music in advance and then never talk about it afterwards. I never get to hear what people were thinking when they were improvising. We just say, hey, great gig, you sounded good, let's hang, So, for instance, it was fun to hear James say that he wanted me to play the melody with him more during that piece a couple times ago because I wasn't feeling that. I wanted to hear James play alone. In terms of preparing, especially for a context like that, when I was hearing that question, I was thinking about, well, what would take me out of the moment? And those are always the things I'm trying to, in my preparation, set myself up for not experiencing, right? So for me, one of the things that really takes me out of musical moments is struggling technically with the instrument. So I spend a lot of my practice time doing a lot of trumpet fundamentals and basics that are sort of preparing my chops, as we say in the biz, to feel dependable. And that comes from practicing regularly, mostly, but also making sure that I'm aware of touching on all sorts of kind of trumpet-specific flexibility exercises, so to speak, and then also being really aware of how much I'm playing, whether it's too much, too little, what kind of concerts are coming up, and just being really aware of what the calendar is looking like, so that I'm not overtaxing myself or under. And I think, to me, that feels very akin to what I think people go through when they're training for any sort of physical feat. It's been a long time since I've trained for any physical feat myself, so. Physical training is an aspect of the instruments that I play, and I'm sure an aspect of all the instruments on stage. So all that's to say, I want to make sure that I'm prepared in any concert to not struggle with the technical side of things, which is a lifelong quest. And then the other thing that often takes me out of feeling comfortable and feeling like I can just execute what's in my head is if I'm doubting the listening of anyone else on stage or struggling with the decisions someone else is making. And that usually comes from, aspects of the group chemistry, people not listening. And I don't mean to blame other musicians that I play with because that's, of course, not the intent here, but it's very helpful when you know that you can trust the people you're playing with to be present in their own music making and to be listening heavily to what's happening and making decisions based on what's happening in the group and not based on things like ego or predisposed, what we call licks, or just like preconceived ideas of where they want the music to go. And so that kind of preparation is a little harder to do. It happens with like knowing who you're gonna play with, and especially experiencing playing with people. So I'm lucky to have developed relationships, musical relationships with everyone on stage. And so I know going into this context that we can rely on each other in a musical setting to be focused and to be listening and to kind of pick up what each other's throwing down. And that, again, is a lifelong quest. It's always something that I'm trying to get better at personally, being able to hear everything that's happening and being able to quell all the sort of ego things that rise up when I'm playing about whether I'm contributing well or sounding good or whether I'm listening enough in the moment. There's a lot of head game things that rise up, especially in a piece like that where there's no form that we've decided in advance and we're purely making things up as we go. So, for instance, that one started with Wayne playing solo, and then the question is, do I want to play and when do I want to play? I was really loving hearing Wayne play alone for a while and then loving hearing Abbey join, and it felt like there was a moment where, yes, I should play something, but then that gets very scary all of a sudden. It's like, what do I play to respond to that phrase that was so beautiful that also sets these two up to know where I'm going? And in that free context, those kind of form decisions are loaded. Whenever you make a decision like that, everyone's recalibrating where the music's going and what they want to be doing in their roles. So that preparation comes with just playing in this context quite a lot, whether it's these people or whether it's any other improvisers, being very used to like understanding where someone might want to take the music just based on the notes that they're playing and the attitude that they're using when they enter.
And you may have noticed that Rocky made a really fantastic, subtle choice, which was in that open improvisation, which he could have done anything, and yet he chose a groove. Right? And it was really satisfying. And it set us all up to be able to now play with that groove. And we all chose to play with it or against it in a different way. But the power of one musician, especially when somebody at the drum set has a particular amount of power in a way, but each of us has to consider the totality of the ensemble and what is going to sound good and best in that moment. And then when somebody makes a choice, the others have a way to either play against that, play with that, make use of that in some new and exciting ways. And so that was an interesting choice of Rocky, which I really liked and was able to play right along with it.
I wonder if you or one of the other band members could be really explicit for the audience and talk about maybe things you've learned by studying and practicing improvisation that you've applied in your life, or that, you know, how is this real for people in their day-to-day lives? How is it real for you when you leave the bandstand? How is it real when you talk to people, when you talk to civilians about improvisation in their lives?
Well, Abby, would you like to take this very complex question on? I'm going to give the hardest question, I think, to Abby.
Okay, how to apply improvisation to day-to-day, right? That's
sure.
The gist?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or I think part of that was too, what have you learned by studying improvisation?
Well, okay. A few things. I would say that when I first started going to UW and met at least Ray around that time, I was exposed to free improvisation and had been focusing on classical performance and like more straight ahead jazz, and so this whole concept of like not having any rules was horrifying. You know, it's like we have social structure, we have, you know, social cues, understanding, and so it really was a learning of another language, or of just like what Ray was saying, how to interact with other people, and so and what their assumptions are, what their characters are in an improvisation situation. So I would say that in that regard, I've definitely learned how to interact with folks, right? And what my role might be in a certain situation. You know, that's musically or otherwise. And especially like playing the bass, it's generally the lowest pitch that you'll hear, and it can really shift the feeling, the harmonic direction. Wayne's looking up like, hey, he's got some octaves too. No. And rhythmically, yeah. So it's, understanding, the power of the instrument that you're playing, and same thing goes for, I'm sure, everybody else on all these other instruments, what you have to offer, and then what you might expect from other people in the situation. Additionally, when Ray was talking, I was thinking about, in the last few years, I've been doing more meditation, and the things that I've noticed in the last few years in free improvisation is noticing things that come up. You're just noticing things, right? Whether that's a thought or a sound, you can't control these things, but they're there. And so whether that's my own noticing of something that I'm playing, going, oh my God, was that good enough? Oh, that wasn't, that totally clashed with what they were doing, but they're, fill in the blank. Or similarly, kind of pointillistically focusing on different instruments in the band, instead of those beautiful glimpses of really hearing everything at the same time. That's, I think, the hardest thing for me personally, and probably a lot of people, I don't know, is hearing the whole thing, right? Not just focusing on the melody or focusing on the groove, right? Not fixating on these things. And so, I think what I'm trying to say is I've learned to try and diversify my attention, both in real life, both in everyday life and musical performance. And that goes for written music as well. It's like when I play in an orchestra, it's like, it's not interesting or fun or musical to just listen to my own part. It's incredibly interesting and fun and musical to listen to the entire orchestra,
Thank you.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Please.
There's a great moment in improvising when you don't know who's doing what,
Yeah.
or you think somebody else is playing what you thought you were playing. And that's something I think is a little bit unique to just improvised music. But also I think your question was also pointed maybe a little bit more to like the specific things people do to prepare. And I just want to make the point that like everybody here spends a lot of time learning how chords work, how harmony works, how scales work, how rhythms work. And it just doesn't matter. You can be playing in a blues band, you can be playing Bach, you can be playing improvised. I'm thinking, and just one last thing, a lot of things that happen in modern improvised music as opposed to ancient improvised music is that we're using more modern materials because we are influenced by modern music. So the fact that I might play two chords that quote unquote aren't related and find that aesthetically beautiful is just a product of me growing up in the 20th century and 21st century and having heard John Coltrane and having heard Stravinsky and having heard Bartok and have heard in electronic music. It's still just, there's triads, there's seventh chords, it's just the same. And I think it's very funny because Abby and I come from completely the different place. You were scared to improvise. I was scared to have a piece of music put in front of me. And we're both dealing with exactly the same materials. That's the point I just want to make.
Yeah, I think beautifully said. And a big part of this is figuring out a vocabulary, learning a vocabulary and a grammar in which to speak that vocabulary, right? You're understanding what your materials are, what you can do on these instruments, what you can do with your knowledge of harmony, rhythms, scales, etc., and then figuring out how to use it, how to speak it. And that, I think, is a really beautiful connection to that sense of your question as well about what have you learned about life, right? That's how you interact with people, how you go back to your recipes and your stew and your so forth, right? Your cooking metaphor. It's how you get through life is making sense of the materials that you have in front of you. Let's play another one. It's called Room 307. Quick little Swinger.
that strikes me about that piece is the transitions between the soloists and the handoffs, and who decides when they're going to come in. And Wayne held back for a measure or two before he started, and sometimes one instrumentalist roars right in after the other. And I love that element of watching this music and hearing it performed live. Before we go any further, does anybody in the audience want to take advantage of the opportunity to ask a question? Please, if you do, raise your hand. If not, that's okay too. But we have a wonderfully talkative group of musicians here today, so please feel free to.
A rarity, talkative musicians.
A rarity. And apparently they like to talk about it if we listen to what Ray said. Okay, I'll keep going. James, when is an ensemble too big to pull off something like this? Have you seen the upper limit? Is there a generally accepted upper limit? I know it might be different. I think of, Wayne talked about in some ancient music, I could think of drummers and some Northern African music where it's a village of people. But I wonder, in sort of the traditions you're accustomed to working in.
Oh yeah, it's another great question. And I should mention for the podcast, when this gets out on the podcast, we're hearing the sounds of a club coming to life, right? The Royal Room here in Seattle is getting ready for the evening, and you're hearing dishes and ice and ice makers and all kinds of things. So I'm cognizant that this will eventually wind up just being audio. So I think that this music, improvised music, has really no limits in terms of its size. There's a wonderful group that was in Chicago for many years called the Peter Boltzmann Chicago 10-Tet, which was 10 musicians up there improvising together. And it made this wall of sound, and sometimes you couldn't figure out, as Wayne said earlier, who was doing what and what was happening, but it made for an incredibly exciting listening. Yeah. I also know of there's a great improvising duo of John Carter and a wonderful trumpet player named Bobby Bradford, just a duo, trumpet and clarinet, that I just thought was fantastic. I also love hearing solo improvisers. And then, as you alluded to, sometimes you can hear a very, very large ensemble playing in different kinds of world music contexts and different global music contexts. So I think there's really no limits. As for me, myself, I really love hearing an ensemble of around between sort of 3 and 6 musicians. I just find, in terms of hearing improvisation, I just feel like I can hear everything. I can hear little groupings develop. I can hear people interacting. I can hear the thinking going on in a small ensemble like that, which is why, for me, I choose to often work in groups between sort of that size, trios into groups with 6. Wayne conducts a wonderful ensemble just about every night here at the Royal Room that Wayne is the leader of it, and Ray and I get to play in that ensemble. It's a big band, like a more traditional big band. It's called the Royal Room Collective Music Ensemble. And although we are playing a lot of compositions, there's also a wonderful amount of improvisation that Wayne conducts. And so that's a very large ensemble that, although we're not all improvising at the same time, we're all kind of thinking about improvisation and improvising with the material, allowing space for soloists and so forth. So I think it's limitless. And for me, I would encourage, if this music is interesting to you, seek out recordings and seek out live performance of a range of different kinds of improvisation so that you can hear the way those groupings develop. A really wonderful recording to listen to, classic recording, would be John Coltrane's Ascension record, which has got to be 10, 11 players. I can't quite remember, but it's probably something like that, if anybody remembers. But that's where you're hearing some of the greats playing all at one time. And it's sometimes hard to figure out who's doing what, but it just makes for incredibly creative and exciting listening.
That's great. Well, I think the best thing we can do for the audience and for the ultimately the podcast listeners is to have the last sound they hear be the band and not my voice. So before I turn it over to you all one final time, I just want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon.
Truly, yeah. And I want
thank you to the
I want to
place.
thank you, Lawrence, for having the vision for this and the podcast. If you don't know the Spotlight On podcast, it's some really, really fascinating conversations. I was privileged to be a guest a few weeks ago, but you're a wonderful interviewer and thinker about music, and I know that you do this with a labor of love, and so I really am grateful to you and to all of you for showing up on a beautiful Saturday afternoon when you can't even get a drink or anything, but stick around and get a drink, of course. And of course, support the Royal Room. Thanks to Ben and to Simon, to Wayne, who's hosting us here at the Royal Room, and to these fabulous musicians, Ray, Rocky, Abbey, Wayne. Give it up one more time for them.
And James Falzone.
Thank you. We're going to play a last composition of mine that it just, again, takes you into a different realm of improvised music. This is a tune that has a very particular melody, it has chord changes, and it has form. And so when we're improvising on it, we are following specific chord progressions, specific form. We have to land in a certain place at a certain time and so forth. This gives you another sense of how improvisers can organize the time. This kind of falls into a little bit more of the traditional way in which you might hear a jazz tune. And this is an older composition of mine. It comes from 2005, which feels like, lifetimes ago. And it's called A Dream in Which Appeared Marc Chagall. Perfect, and the improvised sounds of the bar coming to life. Yeah. Thank you all so much. Wayne, Abby, Rocky, Ray, Lawrence.
And James.
Enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you.